We all have a story, and all those stories are legitimate, at the level they're lived and told. And yet, look how far you've strayed from your deep self. We all hide parts of ourselves from others, and from ourselves. For we may not be quite courageous enough to allow a more genuine self to settle into our bones, into our hearts. But how can you live that deeper story? This is where the incredible tale of the man who wrote the hymn Amazing Grace can teach us a profound lesson. This is the story of John Newton, bawdy sailor, slave trader, prisoner, and ultimately the recipient of a transcendent grace which completely transformed his life. But before I tell you the tale, let me situate it within a certain argument. Every story is incomplete, and so it is that every story told seeks a new chapter, another layer that resolves its tension and finds closure. For that resolution to occur, lessons must be learned and themes mastered. Then, in ultimate transcendence, our story itself is witnessed from outside of ourselves. Here we can draw comparisons with narrative types in literary theory, which explores how we write or tell stories. When we're in an unawakened state, we're merged with the story. The story lives us. This is the first-person, fallible narrator's perspective. Ultimately, by adopting a witnessing perspective, we can begin to transcend the story as a third-person, objective narrator to our own lives. We now live the story. Finally, in very deep states of consciousness, the rarest life narratorial form emerges, that of third-person, omniscient narrator, God-like. We may experience this in flashes of revelation in meditation, dreams, crisis visions, ayahuasca trips, and so on. The study of near-death experiences represents perhaps the most extensive body of report-based data in this respect. Anita Mujani, author of Dying to Be Me, experienced this perspective when she came close to dying from cancer. As she was being rushed to the hospital and slipping into a coma, Mujani suddenly realized that her consciousness was being radically shifted. She found herself in a transcendent realm, looking at her life and all lives from an all-knowing realm. She writes, "I was transformed in unimaginable clarity as I realized that this expanded, magnificent essence was really me. It was the truth of my being. The understanding was so clear. I was looking into a new paradigm of self, becoming the crystalline light of my own awareness." This connection from our deep self is an inevitable part of all our journeys. We're lost, then we're found. That is a grace so amazing that it inspired English poet and clergyman John Newton to write these famous words some 250 years ago. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed." We've all heard the song, but you may not know the story behind it. Born in 1725, John Newton's childhood was one of much suffering and despair. His mother, who held firm religious convictions, died of tuberculosis when he was but 6 years old, and his father was absent for years at sea. Newton was thus raised by his cold and distant stepmother. Newton was soon sent away to boarding school, where his years as a student were marked by angry disobedience and abuse at the hands of his teachers. A brief and bleak childhood all quickly became premature adulthood, as at the age of 11, Newton went to join his father at sea. The Englishman abandoned all faith in religion, writing, and I quote, "Like an unwary sailor who quits his port just before a rising storm, I renounced the hopes and comforts of the gospel at the very time when every other comfort was all about to fail me." Newton became a rebellious and recalcitrant individual, and that behaviour led him to being conscripted into the Royal Navy. But he soon deserted, pursuing courtship with a young woman named Mary Polly Catlett, who was a family friend. Yet no love was bestowed upon him yet, for the humiliation of deserting followed him like a dark spectre, and he was traded to work on a slave ship. The bawdy sailor saw no reason to change his rebellious ways, and his life as a troublemaker continued. Newton's creative flair for language was soon put to use, as he regularly mocked the ship's captain, deriding him with obscene poems and songs. Other crew members shared Newton's coarse sense of humour, and the songs were regular hits on deck. Yet the angry child within Newton wasn't about to let popularity go to his head, and regular conflicts with his fellow seafarers led to periods of chained imprisonment, often without food. Newton thus found himself shackled like the slaves aboard his ship, and almost starved to death. He was then literally enslaved on a plantation in Sierra Leone. Despairingly, the young Englishman became resigned to his wretched fate. But when he wrote a letter to his father describing his situation, the latter intervened. Shortly thereafter, a crew from another ship stumbled upon him, and he was freed. At the age of 23, Newton was sailing on the Greyhound off the northeast coast of Ireland when it was hit by a terrible storm. Furious winds tossed the boat, while angry seas threatened to swallow it. For hours, the crew bailed water from the ship. Newton saw a crew member swept into the turgid sea right before him. To avoid the same fate, Newton tied himself with another shipmate to the ship's pump, stating, "If this will not do, then Lord have mercy upon us," echoing words written in Thomas A. Kempis' The Imitation of Christ, which he had read only several weeks prior. John Newton returned to the deck to take the wheel, steering the battered vessel for almost half a day. In the long hours that it took the Greyhound to reach safety, the seas tossed and turned the vessel, even as Newton contemplated his life and relationship with God. It was another 2 weeks before the ship was able to land in Ireland, a time during which the crew had almost starved to death. But the safety of port did not quell Newton's troubled mind. He started to become more humble and prayerful, asking if his wretched existence could be redeemed in the eyes of God. He felt deep guilt at his neglect of faith and mocking derision of others' religious beliefs. John Newton's story was thus forever changed. God had whispered, and the bawdy sailor began to feel that he had a new mission, to do God's work on earth. But his was no blinding flash of revelation, no instantaneous conversion. It was a slow unfolding over several years. Newton changed his attitudes and behaviour enough to convince Polly's family to allow him to court her and eventually get married. Yet he continued to work as a slave trader, sailing the coast of Africa as the ship's captain, then transporting his wretched cargo to North America. It was only when his health deteriorated at the age of 30 that Newton left the slave business behind. In 1756, he began working as a customs agent in Liverpool, teaching himself Latin, Greek, and theology. And after several years of work in the Church of England community, in 1764 he was eventually ordained and offered the curacy of Olney, a tiny town of some 2,500 residents in Buckinghamshire. Collaborating with William Cowper, Newton wrote the words to Amazing Grace in 1772 as part of a church service. 7 years later, a collection of the religious poems of Newton and Cowper was published anonymously as the Only Hymns. Amazing Grace was then titled Faith's Review and Expectation. To that point, the hymn had had a life of relative obscurity, but it soon became popular in the United States. The version we hear today was set to music by William Walker in 1835. Despite speculation, there's no direct evidence that the wretchedness mentioned in the song refers to the slave trade, and Newton only voiced abolitionist sentiments after he left Olney in the 1780s. It was nonetheless clearly a religious piece, drawing inspiration from the Bible. The reference to being lost and found, for instance, is taken from the parable of the prodigal son, while the theme of being healed of blindness echoes Jesus healing a blind man in the Gospel of John. So this is a wretched story indeed, but it is not only John Newton's story, it is our story. The journey of the hero or the heroine. A tale of a man who becomes lost upon dark and stormy seas, who confronts death and the narrative of his own life, who is then to be born again, his story transformed. Amazing Grace touches a universal theme, that forgiveness and redemption are available to all humans, no matter how much we've violated our deep selves. There's another layer of existence beyond our story of despair and suffering, and it involves a deepening of awareness into an intelligence that is not within our immediate control, forces that our small S-self can barely sense. This is why Amazing Grace is one of the most sung of all songs in the English-speaking world, with thousands of recordings. With every orbit of our planet around our yellow star, individuals of our species sing the song around 10 million times. Many of us live life acting out a story that we did not consciously choose via a self that does not understand who we truly are. If we can accept that without judging ourselves or others, without making it wrong that we've not quite been true to ourselves, then our deep self is ready to emerge. Personally, there have been many times in my life where I felt the presence of an intelligence beyond mine, guiding me through stormy waters. What about you? Have you experienced grace in any form? Please do share your stories in the comments section. I'd love to hear them. I take this story, which I've told you today, from my book Power and Presence, and I explore this theme in more detail there. But stay tuned for more videos like this one on my channel, and do consider liking and subscribing. The next time, may you experience the mystery of grace.